Hi everybody. This video lecture is going to do two things. The first thing it's going to do is conclude our discussion of human nature by briefly summarizing what we've seen from Mengzi, Zunzi's response to Mengzi, and then I'm going to transition into a discussion of Plato and give you a brief introduction to Plato and Plato's Republic. And that way, when we meet next week on Wednesday, we can just get right into the heart of what Plato's up to in Book 1 of the Republic. So we saw today that Mengzi has a conception of human nature that's grounded in the idea that we have a set of natural dispositions that these sort of non-deliberative, immediately responsive dispositions that he thinks make us good. And he argues for that in the form of a simile exchange with the figure of Lao-Tzu, in particular talking about human nature as being like water and wood. So to summarize that exchange, we have here at the top of page 5 of your handout the following quote from Mengzi when he says the following: "When we consider what is present in people, could they truly lack the hearts of benevolence and righteousness? The way that they discard their genuine hearts is like the hatchets and axes in relation to the trees. With them besieging it day by day, can it remain beautiful?" So he here inverts Lao-Tzu's image, right? Remember that Lao-Tzu's image is the image of a tree being chopped down and turned into cups and bowls, and that's the story that Lao-Tzu tries to tell about moral development. Here, the image is precisely inverted by Mengzi and saying that it is when we chop down the tree, when we hack away at ourselves, that we lose the path of moral uprightness. So that's his simile-based way of trying to claim that human nature is good. So Zunzi, who's from the 3rd century of the Common Era, strongly disagrees with Mengzi on human nature, and he instead proclaims the precisely opposite thesis, namely that people's nature is bad and their goodness is a matter of deliberate effort. So the argument here that Zunzi is going to give us proceeds on the basis of a distinction, and he's going to make this distinction, and then he's going to use this distinction to argue against Mengzi. And the distinction is between that which occurs naturally and that which occurs as a result of deliberate efforts. So here's a quote from the middle of page 5 of your handout. It says, "Those things in people which cannot be learned and cannot be worked at are called their nature. Those things in people which they become capable of through learning and which they achieve through working at them are called their deliberate efforts. This is the division between nature and deliberate effort." So our natures are the things about us that we can't learn and that don't really get worked at. And then everything that happens as a result of our deliberate efforts through cultivation is what we deliberately, effortfully achieve. So it's important to recognize that the way the argument will proceed is to assume, that the things about us that don't really change are innate dispositions. Those are the negative qualities, and then everything that's positive and moral and upright about us are what we train ourselves to have through deliberate effort. That will be the claim. So here's another passage from the text that's relevant here. It goes like the following. Beneath the one that I just read. Pardon me. It says, "As for the way that the eyes like pretty colors, the ears like beautiful sounds, the mouth likes good flavors, and the heart likes what is beneficial, and the bones and flesh like what is comfortable, these are produced from people's inborn dispositions and nature. These are things that come about of themselves in response to stimulation." So we're interested here in what just comes about just by being stimulated by our environment. That's our nature. Okay. These are things that do not await being worked at before being produced. Those things that are not immediately responses to stimulation that must await being worked at before they are so are said to be produced from deliberate effort. These are things that nature and deliberate effort produce, and they're different sides. So these two sides of the distinction are meant to be mutually exclusive, right? Either there's something in our nature that is immediately manifest in us through response to stimulation, or there's something that needs to be worked out and developed. So then, having given this sort of morally neutral description of human nature on the basis of this distinction, what Zunzi does is give us a list of what he thinks are paradigmatic human behaviors that are born of our nature. And that's at the bottom of page 5 of your handout. So he says, one of the things we have is a fondness for profit. We like, and that doesn't just have to be financial profit, right? It's not just about having lots of money. That's a particularly human way of thinking about our fondness for profit. But really, if we're being a bit more charitable to Zunzi, we can see here a claim about the fact that we enjoy having things that we like. It's a very broad strokes claim about our desire to accrue goods and to have more, and to, you know, it's a fact about our greed. And he thinks that this fondness for profit is part of our nature, and then if we let it grow, if we let this disposition become active and work in our lives in a real substantial way, then what happens is struggle and contention arise. Because if multiple people are all trying to accrue the same goods, then they're going to struggle with each other for access to those goods. And this will result in yielding and deference coming to perish, yielding up to another person, deferring to another person's need. Those are kinds of moral attitudes that will be prevented from arising by the outgrowth of fondness for profit, or greed. So the idea there is that yielding and deference are the moral correlates of the immoral disposition for fondness of profit, and that only by training and discipline and enculturation can one come to an attitude of yielding and being deferent to others. Similarly, he thinks that things like hatred and dislike are natural dispositions, that if we let them develop in us, will turn us into, you know, cruel villains. That if we don't actively temper our hatred, that cruelty and villainy will arise, and then as a result of cruelty and villainy arising, these sort of active attitudes that develop out of this innate disposition for hatred and dislike, then the moral correlates of cruelty and villainy, namely loyalty and trustworthiness, will perish. And so the implicit claim here is, again, that the moral attitudes of loyalty and trustworthiness are things that are only achieved and fully instantiated in one's character through development, training, effort, deliberate effort. So we naturally have an aversive attitude towards things that don't please us, and that aversive attitude is a kind of primal hatred. And that hatred, if it's not checked, if it's not addressed, if it's not curbed, will develop into cruelty and villainous behavior. And the last one, sensory desire. And recall from class today that the paradigmatic sensory desire is sexual pleasure. It's all well and good to talk about sensory pleasures in the form of beautiful sights and sounds or tastes. But really, when we're talking about the kinds of moral attitudes, what we're really talking about here is sexual pleasure. And we all have an innate disposition to pursue sensual desire, to want pleasure and to crave it and to appropriate it. And when that happens, a kind of lasciviousness and chaos arises. There's agitation in the mind, and this greedy, appropriating mind comes. And when that happens, ritual and yi, ethical uprightness, proper form and order in society, those things perish. And they only exist, those moral correlates of ritual and yi, proper form, order. These things only exist by deliberate effort. They only exist when they're actively, consciously, deliberately cultivated. So again, we see this idea that there's an innate disposition. When it's allowed to run amok, then it results in unwholesome attitudes, and those unwholesome attitudes prevent the arising and the cultivation of their moral correlates. So the conclusion that Zunzi derives from these examples is the following, and this is the top of page 6 of your handout. He says that, look, if people follow along with their inborn dispositions and obey their nature, they are sure to come to struggle and contention, turn to disrupting social divisions and order, and end up becoming violent. So it is necessary to await the transforming influence of teachers and models and the guidance of ritual and yi, and only then will they come to yielding and deference, turn to proper form and order, and end up becoming controlled. Looking at it in this way, it is clear that people's nature is bad and their goodness is a matter of deliberate effort. So the point here again is that all the goods that we accrue in this life are the result of deliberate efforts, and deliberate efforts have been defined in contrast to nature, and therefore our nature is bad. So we see here again a persistent return to the use of similes, and this time the use of the wood simile is qualified so that the wood is crooked. And it says that the crooked wood must await steaming and straightening on the shaping frame, and only then does it become straight. Blunt metal must await honing and grinding, and only then does it become sharp. So also does human nature await proper training and deliberate effort so that it can become moral. So one way to represent this argument that's being made in a more formal way is at the bottom of the 6th page of your handout, and it looks like this. The first premise is going to claim that innate dispositions lead to poor results in human affairs. And the argument for that premise will be the examples that Junsa has just gone through. Then the other claim that is made in premise 2 is that all good results in human affairs are the result of deliberate effort. And that's also contained in the examples, that all the moral ends that we want, all the good things that we want to see in society, when they do arise as a result of our efforts. So we can say premise 3 is a basic moral presupposition of utilitarian reasoning that, poor results are morally bad. Right? So it's morally bad when bad things happen to a lot of people. So fourth premise is that human nature is the province of innate dispositions rather than deliberate effort. Human nature just is by definition that which occurs naturally, normally, and fluidly in response to basic stimulation. But then it follows that human nature is morally bad, right? Because if it's the case that innate dispositions lead to poor results, and poor results are morally bad, and human nature is the province of innate dispositions, then human nature is morally bad. Okay? So that's the argument. Now, at this point, we can start to ask some questions. The main one that I want to raise for you right now, and you can talk about this in your tutorial on Friday, is we note that both Mencius or Mengzi and Junsa utilize images of natural growth and transformation, which are employed as similes to model the way human beings grow and change themselves. So the question you have to ask yourself now is, and we've already discussed how these images are explanatorily powerful for these thinkers. So then the question we have to ask ourselves is, do you find these images helpful? Do you find them helpful? Why or why not? And which do you find more convincing? Why? Those are the kinds of questions you should be addressing in your tutorial sections. So before concluding our discussion of the Confucian arguments about human nature, I want to point out some points of overlap and then between Mengzi and Junsa. And having done that, then reframe their disagreement in a slightly more precise way than we have done thus far. So the agreement here is that both think that intentional refinement of the self is necessary for a good life. So Mengzi thinks that our innate dispositions need to be tended and encouraged to grow. Junsa thinks that our innate dispositions need to be curbed, prevented from growing, and then we actively counteract that process by developing moral virtue through deliberate effort. So both agree that there's a kind of process of self-development happening here that's really important for our moral growth. But then that gives us a way of understanding the disagreement in a more precise way. In particular, Hi everybody, sorry for the interruption. I had a student come need to meet with me, so that's why the video broke right there, but that's okay, we press on. So just to quickly wrap up our discussion of Mengzi and Junzi, the disagreement is about the significance of the intentional refinement of ourselves and how that refinement relates to the question of the moral status of human nature. So Mengzi sees no problem in claiming that we have to intentionally refine and train ourselves, and that we're innately good. Because what are we training ourselves to do? To develop our innate goodness. Whereas Junzi says, no, if you're deliberately training something, if you're deliberately developing something, then it's not your nature. Right? So the fact that we have to deliberately train ourselves to be good is the reason that Junzi disagrees with Mengzi. So what they disagree about is what it is the metaphysical significance of self-training. So Junzi thinks that if you have to self-train, then by definition, whatever it is that is developed on the basis of that self-training is not your nature. Right? So that's the idea. So that will conclude our discussion of the classical Confucian debate on human nature. And the reason we wanted to start there is because the purpose of this class is to think about the nature of morals and the nature of moral agents in society. And so having a grip on this more fundamental question of the individual's nature is important for then asking questions about how the individual fits into their society. And this is where a transition to a discussion of Plato's work in the Republic is particularly apt, because as we'll see, Plato's main concern in the Republic is to think about the relationship between the individual and the society in which the individual is living. Now, before we start to unpack the precise details of Plato's account of that relationship between individual and society in the Republic, what I want to do with you today is just give you a brief primer about Plato's work and why it's so important to the history of philosophy. So, famous philosopher from the early 20th century, Alfred North Whitehead, who wrote an important book called Process and Reality, says in that book that the safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. And he's not wrong. And it is almost impossible to overstate the significance of Plato's thought to the development of Western philosophy. So Plato is thought to have lived between 428 and 348 before the Common Era. And he can be thought of as basically the originator of the Western philosophical tradition. Now there are philosophers before him, his teacher Socrates, and a group of philosophers sometimes known as the pre-Socratic philosophers. Thales is often thought to be the first real philosopher. But from a historical perspective, in terms of influence, systematicity, and depth, Plato is certainly the father of Western philosophy. Now, the really interesting thing about Plato that you need to understand is that everything he ever wrote was in the form of a dialogue, where there'll be characters talking to each other. So he didn't write treatises, he wrote dialogues. And the main character of these dialogues was almost always Socrates, who is his teacher. So we immediately need to recognize that Plato, at every step of his career, refrained from speaking in his own voice. He always spoke in the voice of his teacher. He always put his own views in the mouths of characters that were talking to each other in the dialogues that he wrote. So in spite of this hiddenness of the author, and we'll unpack a little bit about what that might mean in the following discussion. In spite of that hiddenness, Plato founded the first Western institution of higher learning called the Academy in Athens, Greece. And he was a teacher of Aristotle. And Aristotle, who we'll read in a couple of weeks, is regarded by many as one of the greatest philosophers who ever lived. Plato certainly is there as well, but Aristotle's thought dominated the world for hundreds and hundreds of years, and he wrote about everything. Now, we'll get into Aristotle when the time comes, but Plato's influence is not only his own, but it extends through his, having this student who's also a giant. Now, our discussion of Plato will be limited. We will talk about only 3 of the 10 books of the Republic in this class. And in order for that discussion to be fruitful for you, we need to have 2 main ideas of Plato's on the table as just background pieces of information that are relevant to interpreting some of the more nuanced claims he's going to make in the text that we're going to read. So the first idea is what we call Plato's theory of forms. And we will talk about this theory in some depth when we read books 6 and 7 of the Republic in a few weeks' time. So I'm not going to get too into it today. But I will say this. The theory of forms is about trying to solve a particular philosophical problem that has been called the problem of the one and the many. What that means is that there is an interesting philosophical question about what we might call concept membership. So what is it that makes a bunch of particular things the things that they are? So for example, all of you watching this video right now are almost certainly sitting in a chair. What makes every one of those particular chairs a chair? Because we say quite confidently of every single one of them, that's a chair, that's a chair, that's a chair. But what makes them all a chair? What do they share, in virtue of which that each particular discrete, independent spatio-temporal object is the instantiation of something called a chair? Plato's attempt to answer this question is to say that all of the particular things share in a form, in this case, a form of chairness, that there is a literal archetype of which every spatio-temporal particular is an instantiation. The radicalness of this view and the intrigue of this view will have to wait for a further discussion, but that's one of the 2 main ideas that animates Plato's thought. The second of which is the claim that the soul is immortal. This is the view that when the body dies, we are not extinguished, but live on in another world. Now, many different traditions and thinkers have held views of this sort, and we will consider more of them in this course. But Plato, in particular, has a very idiosyncratic conception of what a soul is. And it might be different from the conception of a soul that you would be working with if you were raised in a Judeo-Christian tradition, for example. So the main 3 Abrahamic religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all hold that there is an immortal soul. But their conception of what a soul is tends to be a unified conception. That is, the soul is the immaterial part of you, the spiritual part of you that is unchanging, that lives on after the death of the body. But Plato's view, even though he embraces a version of that immortality claim, his view of the soul is very different in the following way. Unlike the Judeo-Christian tradition, Plato thinks that the soul is not a singular thing, but in fact has 3 parts. The tripartite soul, as it is often called. And that these parts interact in different ways. And it is precisely learning to understand the ways in which the different parts of the soul interact and learning to change the way they tend to interact that constitutes personal and spiritual growth from a Platonic point of view. So the 3 parts of the soul, very briefly, are the following. There's the appetitive part of the soul, that which drives action on the basis of basic reactions to things like hunger, thirst, and lust. Then there's the rational part of the soul. This is the part of the soul that drives action on the basis of reasoned calculation. And then finally, there's what we might call the spirited part of the soul, which is the part of the soul that drives action on the basis of emotion. And it's not hard to have some sympathy for Plato's view, because of course the way I act when I'm responding with a strong emotion of anger is very different from the way I act when I'm trying to fill my belly because I'm hungry, which is again very different from how I act when I'm acting on the basis of a well-formulated goal with reasoned consequences. So the way he distinguishes these three parts of the mind or the soul that drive our actions is quite apt. We are divided in this way. We are often in conflict with each other. We often override our appetites in service of we often defer satisfaction of our appetites in service of another aim. Our emotions often cloud our reasoning. Often our emotions and our appetites gang up on our reason. Even though our reason tells us to do something, our appetites and our emotions tell us to do another thing. This happens a lot. So there's something deeply true about what Plato's trying to indicate here with this tripartite model of the soul. Now, the last thing I'll say to you for today, and then we'll leave off until the following Wednesday, is the following points that I'd like you to keep in mind. The first, when you're reading a Republic, keep in mind that the purpose of the Republic as a text is to explore the relationship between the microcosm of the divided soul and the macrocosm of a hierarchical society. And Plato is going to argue for an isomorphism between them. He's going to say the way society is ordered in terms of the types of citizens that are in it and the way those citizens interact is isomorphic with or structurally overlaps with the different parts of the soul and the way they interact. And because of that, it's going to be very tempting, and it has been very tempting, to think of Plato's Republic as a kind of treatise on political philosophy. But that would be a mistake. That would be a mistake. It is not a treatise on political philosophy. It is about the nature of the soul, and it is about how one should cultivate themselves if they want their various soul parts to be configured in a way that promotes a harmonious life. And the way to answer that question is to engage in an analysis of how the individual lives in a society. But the various parts of the text that prescribe stories about how society should be built are in service of a more transcendental means or a more transcendental end, which is to explicate the nature of the soul and how to live well. It's also important to note, and this will be the last thing I say, that it is a very complicated question indeed about the extent to which this cultivation project is compatible with an active political life. And that's part of the genius of this text, is that Plato never speaks in his own voice for a reason, and part of the reason is that his teacher Socrates is actually executed by the Athenian government. So part of what Plato is up to is examining the way in which living a thoroughgoing, philosophical, spiritual life can or cannot be squared with the sorts of institutions and power structures that are that come about in sophisticated city-states like Athens. So the work is not a straightforward political piece of philosophy. There are a lot of deep underlying messages there, born of the fact that Plato was writing in a time where the government would kill philosophers if they thought that they were stepping too far out of line in corrupting the youth, which is the crime that Socrates was convicted of. So it's important to note that for Plato, it's a life or death situation, and he is writing having lived through the execution of his teacher and mentor. So the hiddenness of the author's voice, the deployment of characters, the use of dialogue is an important rhetorical mechanism for Plato to protect himself. For he's writing at a time where it isn't safe for him to say what he wants in his own words. And the fact that he puts so much of his own words in the mouth of his teacher is telling, because his teacher is the one who was killed by the government. So, read all of Book 1 of the Republic for Wednesday. and we will have a discussion about the arguments contained in that book during that class. It is a difficult text, so be patient with yourself. I will unpack the arguments very carefully for you, so just get through it, do your best, and I will see you on Wednesday.